When Rudolf Höss assumed command of Auschwitz in May 1940, he inherited a decaying Polish army barracks complex in the small town of Oświęcim, roughly 40 miles west of Krakow. What he created over the next 3.5 years was something unprecedented in human history, not merely a prison, not simply a labor camp, but a meticulously organized system designed to strip human beings of their identity, their dignity, and ultimately their lives with industrial efficiency. Höss, who would later testify at Nuremberg with chilling matter-of-factness about his role in mass murder, understood that to kill on the scale the Nazi regime demanded, he first needed to destroy what made his victims human in the eyes of both perpetrators and prisoners themselves. The punishments inflicted at Auschwitz were not aberrations or sadistic excesses. They were essential components of a larger machinery of dehumanization. Auschwitz occupied a unique and terrible position within the sprawling Nazi camp system that stretched across occupied Europe. While camps like Dachau and Buchenwald in Germany had been established primarily for political prisoners and later expanded to include various categories of undesirables, and while extermination camps like Treblinka and Buchenwald, Sobibor existed solely for immediate murder, Auschwitz evolved into a hybrid monster that combined elements of both. It was simultaneously a concentration camp where prisoners labored until death, an extermination center where arrivals were gassed within hours, and an industrial complex where firms like IG Farben and Krupp exploited slave labor. This dual nature, selecting some for temporary survival while condemning the majority to immediate death, created particular dynamics of terror. Prisoners who survived the initial selection on the ramp at Birkenau knew they had been deemed useful, but only temporarily. This precarious existence, constantly balanced between life and death, became a fundamental tool of psychological control. The camp's evolution reflected broader Nazi ambitions and ideology. Established initially in June 1940 to hold Polish political prisoners, priests, intellectuals, resistance members, and others deemed threats to German occupation. Auschwitz held its first transport of 728 Polish political prisoners on the 14th of June, 1940. Tadeusz Wierzchowski, a mathematics teacher from Tarnów, was among this first group and received the number 220 tattooed on his arm, beginning the dehumanizing practice of replacing names with numbers. By March 1941, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, ordered the camp's expansion, envisioning a vast complex that would serve multiple purposes: confining enemies of the Reich, providing slave labor for German industry, and eventually, after the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, formalized the final solution, serving as the primary killing center for European Jews. Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, was constructed specifically for this purpose on swampland, near the village of Brzezinka, its layout designed around murder on a scale that required train tracks running directly to the gas chambers. The hierarchy of authority that governed this death factory was as carefully structured as any corporate organization, creating layers of control that ensured compliance while diffusing individual responsibility, a bureaucratization of murder that Hannah Arendt would later analyze in her examination of the banality of evil. At the apex stood the camp commandant, Höss until November 1943, then Arthur Liebehenschel, and finally Richard Baer. These men reported directly to the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office in Berlin, making Auschwitz part of a larger administrative apparatus that included budget reviews, productivity reports, and efficiency analyses. Höss, a farmer's son who joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and the SS in 1934, ran Auschwitz with the mindset of a factory manager obsessed with meeting quotas and streamlining processes. He later wrote in his autobiography, composed while awaiting execution in Poland, that he viewed the mass murder as a necessary task to be completed efficiently, describing how he studied the operation of other camps to improve Auschwitz's killing capacity. Beneath the commandant operated the SS camp administration, divided into departments handling everything from labor allocation to prisoner property confiscation to the operation of the crematoria. The political department, headed by officers like Maximilian Grabner, functioned as the camp's Gestapo, investigating crimes within the camp, conducting interrogations that were indistinguishable from torture and organizing executions. The camp doctor, most infamously Joseph Mengele from May 1943 onward, held the power of life and death through selections, determining who would work and who would die immediately upon arrival. Mengele, trained as a physician and holding a doctorate in anthropology, exemplified how professional credentials and scientific language could mask murder. His selections were presented as medical evaluations, his experiments as research, though they were nothing more than torture dressed in the vocabulary of science. The SS guards formed another layer, young men often in their 20s, drawn from across the Reich and occupied territories. Many had volunteered for the SS, attracted by the uniforms, the sense of elite status, or ideological commitment to Nazi racial theory. Others were conscripted or transferred from other duties. They received training at Sachsenhausen and other camps that emphasized racial ideology, absolute obedience to orders, and the necessity of maintaining discipline through violence. Wilhelm Boger, an SS officer who operated in the political department, became notorious for a torture device nicknamed the Boger swing, a metal bar from which prisoners were suspended upside down while being beaten, demonstrating how individual cruelty could flourish within this system. The guards worked in shifts, punched time cards, received salaries and benefits, and returned to their quarters in the evenings where they could attend concerts, enjoy meals, and live surprisingly normal domestic lives mere meters from where they committed atrocities during working hours. This compartmentalization was psychologically essential to the system's function. Perhaps most insidious was the use of prisoner functionaries, the kapos, block elders, and camp elders selected from among the prisoner population to enforce order and discipline. This practice, common across Nazi camps, served multiple purposes. It reduced the number of SS personnel required, allowed the Germans to maintain psychological distance from day-to-day brutality, and most crucially, it corrupted the prisoner population itself by forcing some to participate in their own oppression. Kapos received better food, separate quarters, and power over other prisoners in exchange for enforcing work quotas and maintaining order. Some kapos, particularly criminal prisoners identified by green triangles who were often selected for these roles, exercised their power with sadistic cruelty that sometimes exceeded that of the SS guards. Bruno Brodnowicz, a Polish political prisoner who survived Auschwitz, later testified about a capo named Otto Kusel who beat prisoners to death for minor infractions, creating an atmosphere of terror that served German purposes. Other capos, however, tried to protect prisoners where possible, using their positions to distribute extra food, warn of impending selections, or shield the weakest from the worst work assignments. Primo Levi, analyzing this system in his writings, observed that the capo system represented one of the Nazis' most brilliant and diabolical innovations. By forcing victims to become accomplices, they corrupted the very idea of resistance and destroyed moral certainty. The ideology behind discipline at Auschwitz bore little relationship to punishment as understood in any conventional sense. In ordinary prisons, punishment theoretically serves corrective purposes to modify behavior, to deter future violations, to protect society. At Auschwitz, punishment served entirely different functions. It was a tool of terror, designed to break spirits and enforce absolute compliance through fear. It was a mechanism of humiliation, stripping prisoners of dignity and reducing them to the level of animals in their own eyes and in the eyes of their fellow prisoners. And it was, fundamentally, arbitrary. The rules changed constantly, infractions were invented, and punishment was dispensed capriciously, creating an environment where survival seemed to depend on pure chance rather than any rational system of cause and effect. This arbitrariness was not a flaw in the system, it was essential to its functioning. SS Hauptscharführer Gerhard Palitsch, who served as the camp's report leader responsible for maintaining order, exemplified this approach. He would shoot prisoners during roll call for trivial offenses, or sometimes for no offense at all, creating an atmosphere where death could strike at any moment for any reason or no reason. Survivors remembered how Palitsch would stroll through the roll call square with his rifle, casually shooting prisoners who stood imperfectly at attention or whose uniform showed a wrinkle. Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who voluntarily infiltrated Auschwitz in 1940 and compiled detailed reports before escaping in 1943, documented how this unpredictability created psychological torment, surpassing even physical suffering. We could endure hunger, cold, and hard labor, but the uncertainty, never knowing if the next moment would bring death, destroyed men's minds before it destroyed their bodies. The daily routine of prisoners was itself a form of punishment, designed not for productive labor, but for degradation and exhaustion. The day began between 4 and 4:30 a.m. with the piercing sound of a gong, followed immediately by shouting capos and block elders who beat anyone slow to rise from the crowded 3-tiered wooden bunks where 5 or more prisoners shared sleeping space designed for one. Prisoners had minutes to use overflowing latrines, often just planks with holes over cesspits, where dozens of prisoners sat side by side, stripped of privacy, forbidden to talk, guarded by capos, who beat those who took too long. The morning coffee consisted of dark, bitter liquid made from acorns or burnt bread, served in bowls that had to be shared and were never washed. Then came the morning roll call, the appel, which could last hours regardless of weather. During roll call, prisoners stood in rows of 5 organized by barracks, forbidden to move, speak, or sit, while SS guards and block leaders counted and recounted, sometimes deliberately miscounting to prolong the ordeal. In winter, prisoners stood in temperatures far below freezing, wearing thin striped uniforms and wooden clogs without socks. In summer, they stood in blazing sun without water. Philip Müller, a Slovak Jew who survived by working in the Sonderkommando, the special unit forced to operate the gas chambers, and crematoria, described roll calls lasting 12, 18, even 24 hours as punishment for escape attempts or sabotage, with prisoners dropping dead where they stood. The bodies remained in formation, held upright by the press of prisoners around them, until the count was finally complete. Charlotte Delbo, a French resistance member imprisoned at Auschwitz, later wrote in her memoir, Auschwitz and After, "Roll call was when we learned we were already dead. We stood like corpses who had not yet fallen, waiting for permission to fall." After roll call came work assignments. Labor commandos, or Arbeitskommandos, marched out of the camp to construction sites, factories, farms, or the camp's internal projects, always accompanied by capos and SS guards. The work itself was often pointless, moving stones from one pile to another and back again, digging ditches that would be filled the next day, carrying heavy loads at running pace. The purpose was not productive output but exhaustion and degradation. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Read the infamous sign over the Auschwitz I gate, a cruel mockery when the work was designed to kill through exhaustion. Prisoners worked 10 to 12 hours, sometimes longer, regardless of their physical condition. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who could not continue were shot or sent to the gas chambers during the next selection. The midday meal, delivered to work sites in large barrels, consisted of watery soup made from rotten vegetables, occasionally containing bits of meat or fat, more often containing nothing but grass or weeds boiled in water. Prisoners received approximately 1 liter, ladled into their bowls, the consistency and content varying wildly, depending on whether one received a ladle from the top, watery, or bottom, slightly more substantial, of the barrel. Fights erupted over positions in line. Capos distributed soup as rewards or punishments, giving extra to favorites, skipping those who had displeased them. This created competition and resentment among prisoners, further fragmenting solidarity, another function of the system. Evening brought another roll call, then the distribution of bread, the main sustenance, a piece roughly 300 grams that had to last until the next evening, sometimes shared among multiple prisoners. With the bread came a tiny portion of margarine or a spoonful of marmalade or a sliver of sausage. The total daily caloric intake ranged from 1,000 to 1,500 calories for prisoners, performing heavy labor that required 3,000 to 4,000 calories. Starvation was built into the system, a slow-motion execution that killed as surely as the gas chambers but provided labor during the dying process. Survivors calculated they had perhaps 3 months before starvation reduced them to muselmänner, the camp slang for those who had given up, whose bodies had consumed their last reserves, who walked like automatons toward inevitable death. The psychological mechanisms of dehumanization operated on multiple levels simultaneously, each reinforcing the others in a total assault on identity and selfhood. The stripping of names in favor of numbers, tattooed on the left forearm of most prisoners, reduced individuals to inventory items in a vast death factory. Wisław Kila, a Polish political prisoner who received number 290 inches the first transport and survived over 4 years in the camp, later wrote, "I ceased to be Wisław Kila. I became 290. The number was my name, my identity, my existence. When I forgot my number, and in the fog of exhaustion, we did forget, I forgot myself." The shaving of heads upon arrival eliminated another marker of individuality, making all prisoners look similar, interchangeable. The striped uniforms, marked with colored triangles indicating category of prisoner, red for political, green for criminal, pink for homosexual, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on, reduced complex human beings to single categories. Language itself became a weapon of dehumanization. Orders were barked in German, which most prisoners did not understand initially, creating a chaotic environment where incomprehension led to beatings. The German vocabulary used at Auschwitz employed euphemisms that masked murder. Selection, instead of choosing who would be gassed. Special treatment, Sonderbehandlung, instead of execution. Transport, instead of deportation to death. Pieces, Stücke, instead of corpses. This linguistic camouflage allowed perpetrators to psychologically distance themselves from their actions while simultaneously training prisoners to participate in the deception. Prisoners learned this vocabulary, learned to speak of going up the chimney as a metaphor for being murdered in the gas chambers and cremated, developing dark humor as a survival mechanism that nonetheless accepted and reinforced the system's logic. The absolute prohibition on emotional expression created psychological torment. Prisoners could not cry, could not comfort each other openly, could not show grief when witnessing death. All of these were punishable offenses that demonstrated weakness or sabotage of work morale. Mothers arriving with children had to watch those children taken to the gas chambers without protest, without visible emotion, lest they be beaten or sent to join them. Men watched their fathers, brothers, sons die and had to maintain blank faces, rigid postures, moving through the daily routine as though nothing had happened. This enforced emotional suppression destroyed internal psychological defenses, creating trauma that survivors would carry for decades. Elie Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz and later chronicled his experience in Night, described watching his father die slowly and being unable to help, feeling nothing, and recognizing with horror that the camp had killed his capacity. The infractions that could lead to punishment at Auschwitz ranged from the genuinely serious to the absurdly trivial, and often the punishment bore no relationship to the severity of the offense. In fact, the concept of proportional justice, a cornerstone of civilized legal systems for millennia, was deliberately inverted at Auschwitz, where minor transgressions could result in death, while major acts of resistance sometimes went unpunished, simply because the perpetrator was needed for labor. This arbitrariness served a purpose. It kept prisoners in a constant state of anxiety, never certain which actions might bring catastrophe. Kazimierz Smolin, a Polish political prisoner who arrived at Auschwitz in 1940 with transport number 1327, and later became the director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, documented in his post-war testimony that prisoners could be punished for infractions as minor as having a button undone, failing to stand at attention quickly enough when an SS officer passed, possessing an extra piece of string, or looking directly at a guard. Conversely, he noted instances where prisoners caught stealing food, normally a capital offense, were merely beaten because the camp needed their labor skills. The list of punishable offenses evolved constantly. Posted on bulletin boards, that most prisoners couldn't read either because they didn't understand German or because illiteracy was common among certain prisoner populations. Sabotage could mean anything from deliberately slowing work to accidentally breaking a tool. Theft included taking potato peelings from garbage bins to supplement starvation rations. Insubordination might be triggered by failing to remove one's cap with sufficient speed when an SS officer approached, a gesture that had to be performed with a specific motion, whipping the cap off and slapping it against the thigh while standing rigidly at attention. Prisoners practiced this motion obsessively, knowing that a moment's hesitation or an imperfect execution could mean 25 lashes or worse. Attempted escape was one of the few clearly defined offenses, though even here ambiguity existed. A prisoner found near the camp perimeter might be accused of planning escape, even if they had wandered there accidentally or been ordered there by a capo. Beatings represented the most common form of punishment, so routine they barely registered as events worthy of note in the camp's daily horror. They occurred constantly, administered by capos with clubs, by SS guards with rifle butts, by block elders with whips, creating a soundscape of violence that formed the background noise of camp life. But formal beatings, those administered as official punishment rather than casual violence, followed a ritualized procedure that transformed brutality into bureaucratic process. The most common formal beating involved 25 lashes delivered on the bock, a specially designed wooden apparatus that looked like a gymnastic horse. The prisoner was forced to lie across it, their body bent at the waist, arms and legs strapped down, buttocks elevated and exposed. An SS man counted while a prisoner functionary, usually a block elder or capo, delivered the blows with a leather strap or wooden club. Jerzy Bilecki, a Polish political prisoner who arrived in 1940 and later escaped with his Jewish girlfriend Syla Cybulska in a daring plan involving stolen SS uniforms, described the formal beating procedure in his memoir. The entire block was forced to watch, standing in formation while the punishment was administered. The prisoner receiving punishment had to count each blow aloud in German, eins, zwei, drei, and if they lost count or became unconscious, the beating started again from the beginning. The psychological torture of knowing that losing consciousness would mean starting over, that they had to remain conscious and alert enough to count while being beaten, added another layer of cruelty. Some prisoners died during these beatings, their internal organs ruptured by the blows. Others survived but could not walk for days or weeks afterward. Bilecki remembered one prisoner who received 25 lashes for possessing a spoon he had made from a piece of metal. Prisoners were supposed to eat soup with their hands or lap it from the bowl like animals, and who died 3 days later from internal bleeding, his kidneys destroyed by the beating. The standing cells, located in the basement of Block 11, the notorious punishment block that stood like a monument to cruelty in the center of Auschwitz, represented a refinement of torture that combined physical suffering with psychological torment in a space barely large enough for a human body. These cells, called stezel or stehbunker, measured approximately 90 centimeters square, less than 1 meter on each side. 4 prisoners at a time were forced into this tiny space, unable to sit, unable to move, barely able to breathe. They entered through a small opening at floor level, crawling on hands and knees. The opening then sealed behind them. The only ventilation came from a tiny air hole approximately 5 centimeters in diameter. Prisoners sentenced to the standing cell would work their normal 12-hour labor assignment during the day, return to camp in the evening, and then be locked in the cell overnight, standing pressed against 3 other bodies in absolute darkness, in air that became increasingly foul as oxygen was consumed and replaced with carbon dioxide and the stench of sweat and urine. Father Maksymilian Kołodziejski, a Polish priest imprisoned at Auschwitz who survived to give testimony at post-war trials, described the standing cells based on accounts from survivors and his own brief imprisonment in one. The heat became unbearable in summer when 4 bodies in such a small space raised the temperature to levels approaching those of a sauna. In winter, the cold was equally deadly, the concrete walls and floor drawing heat from prisoners' bodies, hypothermia setting in as the night progressed. Prisoners stood on their own excrement and urine. There was no toilet, nowhere to relieve oneself except where they stood. The psychological effect of claustrophobia combined with exhaustion and oxygen deprivation created hallucinations and panic. Some prisoners died during the night, their bodies held upright by the press of the other prisoners in the tiny space. In the morning, guards would open the small door and order prisoners to crawl out for another day of labor. Those who couldn't move were beaten or shot. This could continue for days or even weeks. The record, according to camp documents discovered after liberation, was 27 consecutive nights in the standing cell, though whether the prisoner survived, this is not recorded. Starvation as punishment took various forms, each calibrated to a different purpose within the camp's economy of terror. The most dramatic was imprisonment in the starvation bunker, also located in Block 11, where prisoners were locked in cells and given no food or water until they died. This punishment was typically reserved for prisoners caught in escape attempts or accused of serious sabotage. Father Maximilian Kolbe, the Franciscan friar who volunteered to take the place of another prisoner, Franciszek Gajonicek, a Polish army sergeant who cried out that he had a wife and children when selected for the starvation bunker after an escape from the camp, died in cell 18 of Block 11 inches, August 1941, after 2 weeks without food, water. Bruno Borgowiec, a Polish political prisoner who worked as an assistant to the block leader and was responsible for removing bodies from the cells, testified after the war that Kolbe remained conscious and led prayers with the other condemned men until near the end, that when the cell was opened for body removal, Kolbe was found sitting upright against the wall while the other prisoners had collapsed. After 2 weeks, when the cell was needed for new prisoners, the SS ordered Kolbe killed with a phenol injection because he had not yet died from starvation and dehydration. More common was the use of food deprivation as incremental punishment, the reduction of already insufficient rations as collective punishment for the entire block or camp. When an escape occurred, the entire camp might be placed on half rations for days or weeks. Since normal rations were already below starvation level, this reduction pushed prisoners over the edge from slow starvation to rapid deterioration. Otto Dovkulka, a Czech Jew who survived Auschwitz as a child and later became a historian, remembered in his memoir, Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death, how after an escape in 1944, the entire family camp at Birkenau received half rations for 2 weeks. Prisoners who had been managing to survive on the normal starvation diet began dying rapidly. Children were particularly affected, their smaller bodies having fewer reserves. He remembered watching a boy his own age literally waste away over those 2 weeks, the flesh disappearing from his face until his skull was visible beneath skin, his eyes sinking into dark hollows, until one morning he simply didn't wake up. The Appellplatz roll calls transformed the mundane administrative necessity of counting prisoners into an instrument of collective punishment that could kill dozens or hundreds at once while requiring minimal German effort. The longest recorded roll call at Auschwitz occurred in July 1940, during the camp's early months, when 3 Polish prisoners escaped. SS Hauptscharführer Gerhard Palich, the report leader, ordered the entire camp to stand at attention in the roll call square until the escapees were recaptured. The prisoners stood for 19 hours in the July heat without water, without permission to move, forbidden to sit or kneel or even shift their weight from foot to foot. The SS guards rotated shifts, returning to their quarters for meals and rest while prisoners stood in formation. After dark, searchlights illuminated the square, the prisoners' shadows stretching across the ground as they swayed on their feet from exhaustion and dehydration. Wisław Kieler, present at this roll call, described in Annus Mundi how men began collapsing after 6 or 7 hours, falling forward onto the gravel. Guards walked among the formations, kicking collapsed prisoners, shooting those who didn't rise. The bodies were left where they fell, still counted as part of the formation. Other prisoners urinated where they stood, the liquid running down their legs, the humiliation compounding the physical torture. By the time permission was finally given to disperse the escapees, having been recaptured and brought back for public execution, 20 prisoners had died of exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion. Dozens more died in the following days from the physical trauma. their already weakened bodies unable to recover from 19 hours of standing without water in summer heat. This roll call established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the camp's existence. Escape attempts or other infractions would be punished through marathon roll calls that turned the entire prisoner population into hostages. Winter roll calls carried their own particular horror, the cold becoming a weapon as effective as any the SS possessed. In January 1943, after an escape attempt from Birkenau, prisoners stood through the night in temperatures approaching -25 degrees Celsius, wearing only their thin, striped uniforms and wooden clogs, forbidden to move or stamp their feet to generate warmth. Primo Levi, who experienced several winter roll calls, described the cold as an active force that attacked the body systematically. First the extremities, fingers and toes going numb, then painful as circulation failed, then numb again as tissue began to freeze, then the cold working inward, attacking the core, the body's automatic responses shutting down to preserve vital organs, consciousness beginning to fade, the temptation to simply sit down in the snow and let the cold take you becoming overwhelming. He described watching prisoners give in to this temptation, sitting down despite knowing it meant death, too exhausted and cold to care anymore, and he described the terrible guilt of stepping over their bodies to maintain his position in formation because moving to help them would mean his own death. Public humiliation served as both punishment and entertainment for the SS, a theater of degradation designed to destroy dignity while amusing the perpetrators. Prisoners could be forced to perform humiliating acts as punishment for minor infractions, hopping on one leg while holding the other for hours, doing hundreds of deep knee bends until collapsing, crawling on hands and knees while making animal sounds, fighting each other while guards watched and laughed. In the women's camp, female guards devised particular cruelties. Maria Mandl, the SS Lagerführerin, camp leader, of the women's section, at Birkenau from October 1942 until the camp's evacuation, became notorious for forcing women to stand naked in the snow during roll calls, ostensibly to search for hidden items, but actually as sadistic entertainment. Gisela Perl, a Jewish gynecologist from Romania who was imprisoned at Auschwitz and forced to work in the camp hospital, testified after the war that Mandl would personally select the most beautiful women for this treatment, forcing them to stand naked while she inspected them, making degrading comments about their bodies, sometimes ordering them to perform exercises or dance while naked for the amusement of guards. Torture devices and techniques at Auschwitz reflected both traditional methods refined over centuries of human cruelty and innovations developed specifically for the camp system. The Boger swing, invented by SS Untersturmführer Wilhelm Boger, who worked in the political department conducting interrogations, became one of the most feared instruments. The device was simple, a metal bar placed behind the prisoner's knees, but its application was horrifyingly effective. The prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and then bound to their ankles, forcing the body into a contorted position with the knees bent and the torso hanging downward. The bar was then suspended from hooks, leaving the prisoner hanging upside down, their body weight pulling against joints in unnatural positions. In this position, prisoners were beaten on the buttocks, genitals, and soles of the feet with clubs, the beating continuing until the prisoner confessed to whatever crime was being alleged or until they lost consciousness. The position itself caused excruciating pain as joints dislocated and blood pooled in the head, creating pressure that felt like the skull was exploding. Józef Cyrankiewicz, a Polish socialist who was imprisoned at Auschwitz and later became Prime Minister of Poland, testified at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960 seconds about witnessing the Boger swing being used. He described prisoners screaming in agony, begging to confess to anything, inventing crimes they hadn't committed simply to make the torture stop. Some prisoners suffered permanent spinal damage or hip dislocation from the position. Others died from the beatings administered while suspended, their internal organs ruptured by blows to the kidneys and liver. Boger himself, according to survivor testimony, seemed to take particular pleasure in this method, personally operating the device and conducting interrogations that were exercises in sadism disguised as investigation. He would ask questions to which there were no correct answers, beating prisoners regardless of their responses, the interrogation serving no intelligence purpose but existing solely as torture. Exposure to elements was weaponized with Germanic efficiency, the Polish climate providing both brutal winters and harsh summers that could be exploited to kill without direct violence. Prisoners could be forced to stand in icy water for hours as punishment, their feet and legs developing frostbite that would lead to gangrene and amputation. Witold Pilecki documented in his reports, smuggled from the camp, how prisoners were sometimes hosed with cold water in winter and then forced to stand outside until the water froze on their bodies, creating a coating of ice that had to be broken off. The process repeated multiple times until the prisoner died of hypothermia. In summer, prisoners might be forced to stand in direct sun for entire days without water, developing heat stroke, their shaved heads offering no protection from the sun's rays, some prisoners literally cooking to death as their body temperature rose past the point where organs could function. The penal company, or strafkompanie, represented institutionalized death through labor, a special unit where prisoners sentenced to particularly harsh punishment were assigned to the most brutal work details, while receiving even less food than regular prisoners. The penal company at Auschwitz worked at the gravel pit, an open quarry where prisoners broke rocks with sledgehammers, carried heavy loads up steep inclines, and performed back-breaking labor that served little productive purpose. Guards and capos overseeing the penal company were selected for their brutality. Prisoners in the penal company rarely survived more than a few weeks. Philipp Müller described watching penal company prisoners return to camp each evening, their numbers visibly diminished, replacements sent the next day to fill the gaps, a conveyor belt of death where assignment to the penal company was effectively a death sentence delayed by days or weeks of maximum suffering. Medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz under the guise of scientific research represented perhaps the most grotesque fusion of punishment and pseudoscience, transforming human bodies into laboratory materials while maintaining the pretense of advancing medical knowledge. Dr. Joseph Mengelé's experiments on twins are the most infamous, but the full scope of medical atrocities extended far beyond his notorious work. Dr. Karl Clauberg, a German gynecologist who specialized in fertility research, conducted sterilization experiments on Jewish and Roma women in Block 10 of Auschwitz I, attempting to develop methods for mass sterilization that could be applied to entire populations the Nazis deemed inferior. His method involved injecting caustic substances, including formalin and various chemicals, directly into women's uteruses without anesthesia, causing excruciating pain, infection, and often death. Survivors of Clauberg's experiments, including Alina Bruder, a Polish Jewish physician forced to assist in the procedures, testified that women would scream in agony during the injections, that many developed severe infections requiring hysterectomies, that Clauberg showed no concern for their suffering and became irritated when their screaming disturbed his concentration. Dr. Horst Schumann, another German physician obsessed with sterilization, used X-rays in massive doses focused on prisoners' reproductive organs, causing severe burns, infections, and often death from radiation poisoning. Male prisoners were brought to his laboratory in Block 30 and positioned against X-ray machines that delivered radiation doses far beyond any therapeutic level. Their testicles exposed to radiation that destroyed tissue, caused agonizing pain, and led to surgical removal when the tissue became necrotic. Women underwent similar procedures, their ovaries bombarded with radiation that caused burns so severe the skin would slough off. Felicia Plesowska, a Polish political prisoner who worked as a nurse in the camp hospital, documented these experiments in testimony after the war, describing women who returned from Schumann's laboratory unable to walk, their bodies burned, many dying within days from the trauma. Mengelé's experiments focused on twins, dwarfs, people with physical abnormalities, and anyone who fit his research interests in heredity and racial characteristics. Twins arriving at Auschwitz would hear Mengele calling out, "Zwillinge heraus," twins step forward, during selections, sparing them from immediate gassing but consigning them to a different horror. Eva Moses Kaur and her twin sister Miriam were among approximately 1,500 sets of twins subjected to Mengelé's experiments. Only about 200 individuals survived. The experiments varied wildly, reflecting Mengele's scattered research interests rather than any coherent scientific program. Some twins received injections of unknown substances that caused fever, illness, and sometimes death. Others had blood drawn in quantities that left them weak and anemic. Some underwent painful procedures to measure every aspect of their bodies, spending hours being measured, photographed, and examined. The most horrifying experiments involved attempts to change eye color by injecting chemicals directly into children's eyes, causing terrible pain, infections, and sometimes blindness. Vera Kriegel, a Slovakian twin who survived Mengele's experiments as a child, later described in testimony how Mengele would appear in the twins' barracks like a macabre fairy tale figure, bringing candy and treats, speaking gently to children, creating a false sense of safety before taking them to his laboratory, where he would conduct painful procedures without explanation or anesthesia. This psychological manipulation, oscillating between kindness and cruelty, added another layer of trauma. Children never knew which Mengele would appear, the smiling man with chocolates or the cold scientist who caused them agony. Some experiments seemed to have no scientific purpose at all, crossing from pseudoscience into pure sadism. Mengele reportedly sewed twins together, attempting to create conjoined twins, the children dying from gangrene and infection. He would sometimes kill one twin with a phenol injection and then immediately kill the other to perform comparative autopsies, examining how their organs differed despite identical genetics. These punishments and tortures served multiple overlapping purposes within the camp system, functioning simultaneously as individual deterrents, collective warnings, mechanisms of terror, and tools of dehumanization. When a prisoner was publicly beaten to death for stealing bread, the punishment served to deter others from theft. But more importantly, it demonstrated to all witnesses that their lives held no value, that death could come at any moment for any reason, that there was no justice or proportionality, only power and arbitrary cruelty. When entire blocks were forced to stand through the night because one prisoner from that block had committed an infraction, the collective punishment destroyed solidarity by creating resentment among prisoners toward anyone who might provoke German retaliation, turning prisoners against each other rather than against their captors. The theatrical nature of many punishments, public beatings, public hangings, the exhibition of tortured bodies, transformed the camp into a stage where lessons in powerlessness were performed daily. Prisoners were forced to watch executions, forced to march past the bodies of escape attempt, victims hung from gallows with signs around their necks reading, "I'm back," a grotesque joke referring to the German propaganda that prisoners were well treated and wouldn't want to escape. They were forced to stand at attention during roll calls when punishment beatings occurred, forbidden to look away, compelled to witness and absorb the message. Resistance is futile. Disobedience brings death. Your only choice is submission or destruction. Rudolf Höss, one of the few prisoners who successfully escaped from Auschwitz in April 1944 and subsequently co-authored the Wrubber-Wexler report that first alerted the world to the full scale of Auschwitz's extermination operations, later reflected on the psychology of these public punishments, observing that they created a learned helplessness where prisoners internalized their powerlessness so completely that most couldn't even imagine resistance, let alone act upon it. The snow fell thick and heavy on the morning of the 27th of January 1945, when soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army's 1st Ukrainian Front approached the gates of Auschwitz. What they found there would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of industrial-scale cruelty and force the world to confront questions of justice that had never before been contemplated at such a magnitude. Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Shapiro, leading reconnaissance units of the 100th Infantry Division, had seen the devastation of war across Eastern Europe. His men had liberated other camps. They believed themselves prepared for what lay ahead. They were wrong. As the first Soviet troops entered Auschwitz first around 3 p.m. that Saturday afternoon, they encountered approximately 7,000 prisoners who had been too weak, too ill, or too near death to be included in the forced death marches that the SS had organized in the preceding weeks. The Germans had fled just days before, hastily attempting to destroy evidence of their crimes by dynamiting crematoria and burning documents. But they had left behind a landscape of horror that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. The liberation was not a single moment but an unfolding revelation. At Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the largest section of the camp complex, Soviet physician Yakov Vinokur remembered entering barracks where skeletal figures lay motionless on wooden bunks, their eyes following the soldiers with expressions that mixed disbelief, fear, and something beyond hope. Many prisoners initially thought the Soviets might be Germans in disguise, another cruel trick in a place where deception had become routine. Some were too weak to speak. Others whispered questions. "Are you really here? Is it over? Can we leave?" What struck the liberators immediately was the physical evidence of systematic punishment and torture that permeated every corner of the camp. The standing cells in Block 11 of Auschwitz, concrete chambers measuring less than 1 meter square, where 4 prisoners at a time were forced to stand throughout the night after working all day, stood as architectural testaments to calculated cruelty. Dr. Otto Wolken, an Austrian prisoner who had worked in the camp hospital and survived to liberation, later documented how prisoners subjected to this punishment often died after several consecutive nights, their bodies simply giving out from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. The Soviets discovered mountains of evidence the fleeing SS had failed to destroy. In the warehouses, the prisoners had grimly nicknamed Canada because Canada represented wealth and abundance to European prisoners. Soviet troops found 836,255 women's coats and dresses, 348,820 sets of men's suits, and over 7 tons of human hair packed in bags ready for shipment to German factories. They found 460,000 shoes. The sheer quantity spoke to a scale of destruction that defied immediate comprehension. Each coat, each shoe, represented a human life erased with bureaucratic efficiency. Captain Vasily Gromadsky, one of the first Soviet officers to enter the camp, later recalled the children. There were approximately 500 children at Auschwitz when the Soviets arrived, many of them twins who had been subjects of Joseph Mengelé's medical experiments. These children bore tattoos on their arms, the infamous numbering system that reduced human identity to an administrative code. Some children could not remember their names. Others clung to Soviet soldiers, crying, touching their uniforms to confirm they were real. A photograph taken by Soviet photographers showed a group of child survivors displaying their tattooed forearms through barbed wire, an image that would become one of the most enduring visual documents of the Holocaust. The Soviet army brought field hospitals and medical personnel, but the challenge of providing care was overwhelming. Primo Levi, the Italian chemist and writer, who would later chronicle his Auschwitz experience in seminal works like If This Is a Man, was among those liberated that January. He described the surreal quality of the first days of freedom, the silence after years of constant shouting and commands, the absence of systematic violence, the slow awakening to the possibility that they might actually survive. Yet, freedom came with its own trauma. Some prisoners, upon learning they were liberated, died within hours or days, their bodies, pushed beyond endurance, simply ceased functioning once the survival imperative relaxed. Soviet forces immediately began documenting what they found. Photographers and filmmakers arrived within days of liberation. Roman Karman, one of the Soviet Union's most prominent documentary filmmakers, shot footage that captured the skeletal survivors, the piles of personal belongings, and the crude cremation pits where bodies had been burned when the crematorium ovens could not keep pace with the killing. This visual evidence would prove crucial in the coming months and years, as the world struggled to accept the reality of what had occurred. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission, established to investigate Nazi war crimes, began collecting testimony immediately. Survivors like Sewerina Szmaglewskaja, a Polish political prisoner, provided detailed accounts of the punishment systems. She described the Appellplatz, the roll call square where prisoners stood for hours in all weather, sometimes for entire days, as punishment for escape attempts or minor infractions. She recounted watching prisoners collapse from exposure during winter roll calls that stretched from dawn until night. their frozen bodies left where they fell as warnings to others. The documentation extended beyond testimony. Soviet investigators measured the gas chambers and crematoria ruins, calculated their capacity, and attempted to determine the total number of victims. They examined the standing cells, the execution wall between blocks 10 and 11, where thousands had been shot, and the medical experiment facilities where prisoners had been subjected to procedures without anesthesia. Each discovery added another layer to the emerging understanding of Auschwitz, not as a mere prison camp, but as a facility designed for industrial-scale murder and systematic torture. Medical officer Leonid Zbarsky examined survivors and documented the physical effects of prolonged starvation, beatings, and torture. Many prisoners weighed less than 35 kilograms. Their bodies showed evidence of repeated trauma: broken bones healed incorrectly, scar tissue from whippings, frostbite damage, and the distinctive muscle wasting that comes from extreme malnutrition. The medical documentation provided scientific corroboration of survivor testimony, creating an evidentiary record that would prove essential in subsequent legal proceedings. In the darkest silence of Auschwitz, punishment was not just physical, it was the deliberate unraveling of hope. Names like Rudolf Höss and Joseph Mengele became synonymous with cruelty, while the prisoners' silent endurance became a final act of defiance. From standing cells, where 4 people were forced to remain upright all night, to starvation bunkers echoing with the last prayers of men like Maximilian Kolbe, these punishments sought to erase humanity, and yet humanity endured. As we close this story, we remember the words of Primo Levi, a man who survived to bear witness. It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. Let us not turn away, but remember, so that such silence never falls upon the world again. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, history speaks not to punish, but to warn.